When do humans actually do better than the AI? And when does the AI do better than humans? And how do we leverage both of those things in a way that they don't disturb each other?
Plug and play, as much as I wish it were true, is just not the way that technology really works within healthcare.
You can see how it's going to work technically. You can test how it's going to work technically, but you don't hurt anybody.
Catching a heart attack in the ER can be like finding a very dangerous needle in a haystack. Today's guests are building a startup to catch heart attacks before it's too late. Dr. Maya Yiadom is a Stanford emergency physician whose research has shaped how ERs across the country evaluate chest pain. Her co-founder, Dr. Gabrielle Bunney, is also a Stanford emergency physician, an MBA, who brings both frontline clinical insight and business rigor to the company's vision. Together, they're working to transform how we detect and treat heart attacks, and the story behind it is fascinating. Well, Gabrielle and Maya, thank you both so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting
Thank you so much
us.
for having me.
I will confess this is the first podcast conversation I've had with two people at once, and we're all in separate locations. So I'm just going to enjoy any awkward talking over into conversations that happen, and I encourage you to feel great about any awkwardness too.
I feel like you would have thought we would have been better with Zoom and whatnot, and yet still, I feel like we're all of the talking over and whatnot still remains the same.
Yeah, that was the human factor.
Yeah.
I'm going to dive right in. I have a bunch of questions for you both, some about SmartCare, some SmartCare AI, I should say, some about your own individual journeys. Yeah, let's begin. I would love it if one of you would be willing to share the unmet need that sort of led to SmartCare and really paint the picture, paint what that story looks like for the layperson, the lay audience that might not be as familiar with the flow of things in the emergency room.
You know, the need or having some insight into the need for SmartCare AI goes back like many, many years. And I'll share personally, having got very excited after finishing my training and was working in emergency departments of all kind across the country. Sort of the mindset, drop me anywhere. We could do emergency medicine with any resource level, any location, any set of patients. And just realizing some of these standard things that just were very protocolized, their guidelines around them were trained very well, and this is how it's done. Everybody was doing it according to guideline, but the way it was getting done varied so vastly. And it sort of felt like some places were probably doing it right and other places were doing it wrong. And so the interpretation of the how to do it was like uninformed, and everybody was really creating their own approach locally and was realizing that what was
the way it's getting done. You said, if we could just double click on, you said everybody was following guidelines, but was different in the way they were doing that.
Yeah. And
what does that look like?
And just to clarify, really talking about heart attack screening, people are sent to emergency departments when there's concern either from them or from somebody else who's taking care of them in another medical environment that they need to come to an emergency department. It's one of the few places you can get care 24/7 for an acute presentation without scheduling and just walking in. Not to mention, we've got the resources to get emergent treatments mobilized. So the treatments are already in on call. It's just a matter of finding the right people for those treatments. And the time factor is huge. Or really, I should say it's small. We need to identify those patients within 10 minutes, and it's very difficult to do anything in like the really chaotic environment that you walk into when you first go into an emergency department where you have a lot of people who are just not feeling well. And figuring out what that means and which of those not feeling well symptoms that they're reporting equates to a potential heart attack. It's almost like trying to figure out the end of the story at the beginning before a doctor's even involved. You're just trying to get their name and why they're there and who they are. So looking at patients who had come to the back where I was as the doctor, who clearly said the things that should have triggered certain activities to get them identified as one of these patients that needs emergent care. Sometimes it wasn't happening and it wasn't clear why. And so I started getting more and more interested in walking out to the front in each of these emergency departments and asking them, hey, it looks like this person should have gotten an EKG, which is a test that would have been triggered as the first step. And hearing, well, they just seem so anxious. We tried to get you to get them Ativan, but you wanted to see them first, and that's why they waited 2 hours. And
Oh my
just
gosh.
realizing some of these interpersonal heuristics, the fact that all the symptoms that people could walk in with that could be a heart attack, it's a very long list. Most of the time, it's something else, something that we see far more often. So it's sort of this needle in a haystack problem that is very difficult to ask humans who are also non-clinicians at the front door to do this at a level of complexity that we've trained our physicians to do, but the physicians are in the back. And it would not make sense to have them at the front door, given that heart attacks are not the most frequent thing happening in the ED for a doctor's attention to be drawn to. So got very intrigued with why this was happening and started thinking about like what does the process flow look like just from a clinical operations? How do we, manage clinic flow for when patients come in? Started thinking about what does this mean for patients around the country? So studying like how many people does this affect who have heart attacks and come in and experience delays. Started looking at the different providers involved who are all doing their best, but their communication gaps. And then really started realizing that this is just a matter of you need to ping the right people in the right sequence at the right time. And this is exactly what analytics and AI is designed to do. And there's data that flows with all these steps. So really started to think about how do you leverage that data environment that tandems with the patient dynamic and all the staff involved to get the right care for the right people at the right time. And I think it was right around this time that, um, you know, for myself as a clinician who got interested in the operations and then really got deeply interested in finding the answer as a researcher, um, moved from doing the epidemiological work and understanding the clinical environment to really wanting to build the solution, which put us in the analytics space. Had the opportunity to meet Dr. Bunney, a rather chance encounter driven by her interest in some things she had heard me talking about and said, hey, this is what I'm crafting my career to do. And really both lending the costing factors from finance of there's a cost associated with not doing it and doing it right, but also the analytics capability. I think the two of us has really spent the past 5 years working on a solution that's turned into SmartCare AI.
Wow, what a journey that's been already. I'm wondering if you could paint the picture of what are the consequences without actually spotting people early. What are the consequences for someone that you find out 2 hours later really ought to have had that EKG when they walked in the door? And are these things that either of you were seeing and watching play out in real time? And
Yeah,
Start
no,
first.
absolutely. And I think, I as Maya was mentioning, right, time is the biggest factor, right? The research has really shown that the treatments that we have available for heart attacks only work within a 90 to 120-minute window. And so we're really in the emergency department working backwards from that time period. And so we know that people who get no treatment, that they can have upwards of a 40% mortality rate. And for even those who are then getting treatment, but it might be too late, they're actually having a higher rates of heart failure. And so we know that heart failure has a high morbidity and mortality in and of itself. And so then you're starting to see the consequences of this prolonged heart failure, people not being able to recover, people having repeat visits to the emergency department, ending up in the ICU for their heart failure exacerbations. And so, really, not being able to get this in the right time period can have very significant consequences that include death, but can go in even into beyond it, where the patients are living with those consequences for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and
wow,
it just seems like it's, as emergency physicians, we are ready and armed with the treatments ready to go. And, a lot of our job is making the call from when somebody's sick and not sick. And when they're sick is we are often treating people before we even understand exactly what the disease is specifically. We start treating the physiology of they're sick, their blood pressure's down, their temperature is up, they're altered, they need to be elevated, they need to be laid down on a bed. We address all those things while sort of in almost an expanding process, getting more and more data over several minutes to hours. And heart attacks seem like they're such a crisp thing to be able to do the right testing to find out you do this test, you find out this information, you do that test, you find out this information. It is or isn't a heart attack, or you figure out which ones they are. And so it seems of all the things that we do that are difficult, this one feels so straightforward for us to have uncovered how infrequently we do it right, is really disheartening. And so I think from the perspective of what we're on the front lines to do, I felt really committed to finding a solution. I will say there is one patient, I alluded to her earlier, the patient who I walked out to the front. I walked out to the front of many emergency departments to ask, what's going on up here? I'm either getting too many tests or too few tests, or I'm getting patients coming back that should have been back here much earlier. There was one patient who came back and had probably the worst version of a heart attack crushing story going on for hours, had been in the emergency department for hours, but was
Mm.
actually held off to the side in the waiting room because she was behaviorally disruptive. Um, and
Wow.
I think, being Hispanic, speaking part English, being very anxious in her presentation and not saying I'm having chest pain, but saying like, I feel like I can't breathe. I feel like the world's being sucked away from me. That just didn't feel like a legitimate chief complaint for a heart attack. Rather, it just seemed like somebody who kept coming up to the front desk was not interpreted as sick, was interpreted as disruptive. And really thinking that if you looked objectively at the chart, she said all the right things. She was a 65-year-old female who had said essentially, I can't breathe, which is the equivalent of shortness of breath, which is the number 2 symptom for a heart attack. And it just didn't align with the heuristics of what people are looking for. And we missed the window of opportunity for her. And she lives with that for the rest of her life. So there have been some, at least for me, some personal cases, like individual patients whose stories have inspired the work. I think looking, as Gabrielle was saying, more broadly at all the patients who suffer from this. And then I think too, just from an ethics perspective of what we're even there to do, it just seems like it's an unfortunate situation to fail in.
And I actually think, to build on that, right? You're building, you're saying you're looking at the chart. It can seem very objectively bang, 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 like this is very clearly could have been a heart attack. And I think, though, what you're also alluding to is it's not completely crisp. It's not always the person who's coming in with that crushing chest pain who says it feels, an elephant sitting on my chest. Oh, look, here's the EKG. Oh, look, here we go. Right. Where the time that's being built in is also the discussions that we're having with cardiology and our other consultants of other things that it could potentially be. And so we're building in a lot of that time within the time window that it takes to get the patient up to the definitive amount of care. But I think what was also important about that is there was a general gestalt that when you looked at, and when you looked at this patient, you can tell sick, not sick, can kind of figure out from the story the things that we've learned over time to interpret as concern for a heart attack. And I think what's important is that there's no clinician sitting at the front desk. It's a registration clerk who's working very hard to help keep the emergency department flowing, keep getting those patients registered, bringing them in. They have a queue of 5 or 6 people who still need to get into the front door, and they're being tasked with, if you think there's a heart attack, you have to do this life-saving intervention. And that's a huge burden. And for somebody who that was not their original job. And so the idea of SmartCare AI is really to bring that clinical gestalt mathematically into that registration clerk's computer to upskill them, to allow them to really empower them and upskill them to allow them to help make that decision that this person needs an early ECG. And we've actually even started to see, emergency departments doing quality improvement projects to really work on this door to ECG time. And their response has been great. Put a nurse there, which is fantastic, right? Nurses are wonderful. They're able to, we see that it really improves their rates of getting these early ECGs, which is fantastic. But now you're saying, okay, you have to put this highly skilled person in a chair in the front door to help determine who needs that early ECG. And I think we can leverage
Hmm.
our nurses to do a lot more things and have them sit there, especially if we can use technology in a very meaningful way within that space.
This is really interesting, and you both have touched on some of the questions that were circling my mind at the beginning of all this. Maya, you have done extensive research in disparities in cardiac care, and some of my questions were diving into what that actually looks like at the ground level. And this has been, some of these stories have really kind of highlighted what that looks like on a granular level. And Gabrielle, you just now left off with the next question that I had for you, which is, as we start to look at integrating SmartCare AI and sort of building that into the process, very curious what has been surprising about the process, about integrating and sort of testing what that integration might look like.
Uh, Plenty of surprises.
Yeah.
Plenty of surprises to be had. I think what's really been exciting about the data science space, right, is that you're able to build things within a computer, right? And you're able to test things from a retrospective, way within your computer. And then I think there's a perception that, oh, okay, you can just go plug it in, right? It just, what the translation, right? You're just taking the model and you're plugging it into a different system. Like, what's the big deal? And the fact is it is a really big deal. And it requires, it requires really understanding to think about the integration and then to think about how that integration is going to be monitored moving forward. So it's not just about the model. So I would think about it in a couple of different ways. So one is the clinical workflow integration. Two is the technical integration. And then three is the monitoring in the long term, which each require different important components. From a clinical workflow integration, to some degree, this can almost be the easiest. And the reason I say that, and when I say easiest, I mean it very relatively, but it's because everything that we built started with the workflow in process in mind, right? Our entire problem in question was based on a workflow to begin with. It wasn't, oh, this is a great idea. We want to improve heart attacks without really taking into account how things currently work. And so we know where within the workflow to be able to plug in, and being able to get key stakeholders involved has been critical to allowing that to work, to be able to work through in a smooth fashion. The technical integration really takes into how data is moved in and out of an electronic health record. You're dealing with the niches of each of those electronic health records to figure out how data flows in and out. And for us, timing is everything. There's a lot of models that you can see, they'll make a prediction maybe 6 hours later, or maybe within 24 hours later, we'll be able to take a look and see, did they trigger a sepsis alarm or something like that, right? And so the timing of that, we're looking, I need it in a couple of minutes. I need data in, I need data out, and I need a solution pushed back in within a matter of minutes. And so being able to hook that in very specific ways requires a lot of detailed nuance and trial and error, frankly, to figure out a reliable system, right? It can't sometimes work. Oh, sometimes maybe it didn't quite make it. We need it to work consistently every single time. And so that's been a really important part of the work that we've been doing. And then the third is the monitoring long term. We know that AI models have degradation over time. We know populations have shifts and drifts within the disease incidence and into their composition. And so being able to then appropriately collect the data that is being used, and data down the line is another part of the build, of the original build, that is critical for it to be successful in the long term. And so it's been a wonderful journey. It's been filled with lots of learning, but it is not. But one thing, if I can truly emphasize, is plug and play. As much as I wish it were true, it's just not the way that technology really works within healthcare.
Ah,
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll maybe add to that saying, I think healthcare is a really, there's a new White House communication that just came out a few days ago that, starts off saying that healthcare is really resistant to change and adoption in the AI space or just in general. And I think a lot of folks on the data scientist side and on the tech side feel like that's just a barrier that's in the way. But, our business, so to speak, is very different than other industries. Like the business isn't about just selling what people will buy. People are not in a position to often define their need. So there is a little bit of, and pardon me for using the terminology, but a paternalistic responsibility, almost like a fiduciary responsibility to act on behalf of the safety of our patients. And so there's a resistance to with our do no harm ethic that we all sign on to when we start medical school. We don't even know how to do medicine yet, but we sign on to the idea of do no harm is how we work. Where we have to know that it won't hurt somebody before we even try it, which is not how the tech industry works, which is not how engineering moves forward. In fact, they do the opposite. They get something good enough to move forward, and then as it's breaking, they fix it, almost like building the plane while you're flying it. And that's just not how medicine and healthcare work. So it makes it resistant to being excited about the innovation. And it needs to fully understand how it's going to work and not work and potentially harm people and succeed and quantify those before you get a yes. So, in some ways, I think people feel like it's just in the way and it prevents them from really thinking about why it's that way and how do we address those needs in order to move the innovation forward. And I think what we found is that people say, oh, just plug it in. One is they haven't thought about what plugging it in means because part of plugging it in is answering all these questions, both medically, clinical, like human interaction, and technically with all the three steps that Gabrielle was just sharing. The other side is really the part about like there's innovation in that space to be had. Innovation change management and early adopters, and where do you learn your earliest lessons? We've really worked with the idea of silent pilots to do the data integration, but also to demonstrate the harm and the benefit, quantify it, fix any harm before actually deploying it for patients. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot more work than we think many of our colleagues on the tech side, who are not in healthcare, have the experience to bring to the table to get a yes. So, we've been, I think, really trying to share that experience with our colleagues just to really advance their success in the healthcare
Mm.
space.
I was just going to add on to that because this is, I think, something Maya and I have discussed a lot is that the healthcare tech space really bridges that more traditional life sciences, trials that occur in very meaningful steps, with individual purposes for, thinking of drugs and things like that for proving its efficacy. But then at the same time, when we talk to life science people who completely understand that approach, but then we start to talk about the tech and the integration, and they're not quite following along that conversation. And then you talk to this tech side of things. And I think when we think of healthcare tech, it tends to sit more on the tech side, just because those tend to be the colleagues that we're really working with,
Mm.
or a lot of people end up working with from a technology perspective, building the engineers, finding those collaborators. Whereas I feel like our hearts seem to lie sometimes almost on more of the what we're used to of the biology and the life sciences, and really taking into the healthcare innovation, healthcare tech space, and really taking apart those two components and recognizing that it is a true marriage between those two and finding that happy medium, because failing fast is not necessarily the best approach in these cases.
Maybe I'll go back to the last thing that you were saying, Maya. You were kind of emphasizing a little bit of this misconception where some people say, "Oh, just plug it in," and it's not really that easy. And you were touching a little bit on something I thought was so interesting that you referred to as silent pilot studies. Would you mind just recapping what you're sharing about that?
Yeah, maybe to take a step back, I always think it's interesting when we say, we'd like to implement this, and people, their first reaction is like, oh, all you have to do is build a model and plug it in. But then when you say we're ready to plug it in, the number of regulatory barriers that come up is impressive. And so it's almost this two-sided. It's either very far to the right-hand side or very far to the left. But where we found silent pilots to both meet the excitement about getting it into the system and getting it closer to patients, but also being able to get evidence and prove to ourselves that it's safe and it actually does have the impact we intended, is really leveraging, I think, what Gabrielle was sharing, this idea there are the people who are in the moment, both the patients and the providers, real time, while care is happening in an emergency department. On top of that, there's a data flow that happens in the computing system that people use to get things done, to take care of patients, to order labs, tests, to communicate amongst one another. And then there's the informatics flow that transfers that data to different systems, both in the moment and then after the care is completed. And when we're talking about plugging it in, we're plugging it into that informatics system in order to leverage that data in order to influence the human interactions. And so what we found is that if you're able to overcome the hurdle, the technical hurdle, by taking the algorithm, the AI, the technical intervention, and putting it into the live real world care system, but not having it yet affect the human level of care, you're able to basically have it run in parallel for every patient with the care that they got from humans. And what's been interesting is that one, you get the do no harm effect. You can see how it's going to work technically. You can test how it's going to work technically, but you don't hurt anybody because it's not doing anything for anybody yet. The other side is you almost with a very straightforward, and I'm going to speak like from the research perspective, straightforward like design for how you want to run this experiment, you get very close to the level of like the ultimate type of research design, which is a clinical trial, where every patient ends up being their own case, which is what's happening in the with the algorithm or the AR or the intervention technically, but also a control for what happened when humans were taking care of them. And you can compare not the full story, but at least the story up until where decisions would be made, to where tests might be pushed forward to see how well they align. and when they're different. And difference could be where the tech actually has an advantage, and then you can measure that. The difference could also be when the humans perhaps have the advantage. And I think for us, a lot of our lessons were really figure out when do humans actually do better than the AI, and when does the AI do better than humans, and how do we leverage both of those things in a way that they don't disturb each other, which was a whole other level of innovation that you can't
Wow.
see just tinkering with models on a computer.
Wow, that is so cool. That's really neat. I think that that may be one of the most sort of unexpected or exciting things for folks who hear about this and have no idea what it's actually like to start. I wouldn't even say implementing it, but the work you need to do to sort of justify, and that's really cool. I guess along the lines of folks who are in medicine but haven't yet built a thing, want to sort of dip their toes in innovation. Would you be able to share what you both are thinking about in terms of how to decide when you leave the bubble of Stanford or of academia, and what that looks like, and if it's as scary and intimidating as it sounds, and it just tell us about that whole complex ball of wax.
Well, I was just gonna say that I think, it is complex and it is a ball of wax. But it also is it's a major opportunity, and I think, as difficult as some of the decisions are, I think they're more difficult than if you are not in an academic environment and you're innovating from a different type of place, whether it's industry or just even on your own. Um, being in academia has lots of advantages. Our jobs are to be doctors and to teach and to do research, and, for us, research has turned into innovation. So it's really nice to have like, your main gig, so to speak, already build in the opportunity to invent and create. And then to be at a place like Stanford, and I think many places as well, where there are resources and tools at scale for people who think like you, who are also trying to invent and create. Um, so the decision point, I think, for us, and we have many conversations about this, is when is the work um, best supported by this academic environment that offers us a lot of resources that most don't have at their disposal? Have we learned to use all the resources effectively? And then when is the next step in the advancement to getting to goal, which is one, getting this out to market, but even more importantly, the market being a vehicle to getting to patients and saving lives and hearts. When is that next step best served outside of a university environment or not served by staying in a university environment? And the answer to those questions are not straightforward. Um, Gabrielle had mentioned earlier this divide between life sciences and health tech is
Mm,
tricky because the pathways and the answers for life sciences and health tech are very different. Life sciences tends to stay inside or get support from the outside and the inside in ways that are legitimate and acceptable to universities. Whereas on the health tech side, there's usually a huge advantage in moving very fast on the outside and really being able to incubate and support the incubation within a university is not yet typical practice or what that side of industry is comfortable with. So, is it that we're on the cutting edge of raising these questions? We like to think so. But we do think that also industry being innovative about appreciating the do no harm space of medicine and healthcare might open up opportunities to leverage what life sciences has been doing for decades. And so, our
mm,
hope is that we're able to see that there's this gap in the space, that we really have these two pathways that we can lean on for how to move forward. And really, the challenge that we've had is when is one pathway's best offering inside or outside the next right step for the work. And I think we're getting closer to making the decision to be on the outside, but still very actively working from the academic perspective within the university.
I'll add that it's certainly a very tricky balance to be able to strike, and I think it's also about thinking about what it would look like on the outside, on the inside, and already beginning some of those processes. I think what I was really alluding to was being able to kind of maximize what we can really leverage from within, which is an incredible opportunity and really an incredible workspace where we're with the problem. We're not observing the problem from the outside and wondering about, oh, how does it work? How can we make this function? We are sitting right next to the problem, quite literally, in terms of where we sit in the emergency environment. But we are working with the problem directly, and that really allows us to, I think, maintain a degree of creativity even as we're continuing to iterate around what the final solution is really going to ultimately fully encompassed as an integrative product within clinical care. And I also do want to add, because you were mentioning for thinking about others who are thinking about moving into this space, because I've had a lot of conversations between those who are either inventing on their own versus wanting to join ventures with somebody else having already invented, or even just really looking into maybe even moving into more of the financial investing space, and really remembering what our competitive advantage is that we are bringing to the table. As you know, in coming from the clinical space, right, our biggest advantage is really our how we take care of patients, our ability to recognize the problems and being able to recognize what our patients are telling us they need. That, where you see companies, they have all these focus groups with their with patient populations, asking them, what do you need, what are the things that you really want, whereas I'm sitting in a room with them telling me what they need, and I don't have to organize anything, I just have to show up to work. And so being able to really feel connected to the patient and be able to bring those years of experience of working with patients into something that can solve patient problems is, I think, incredibly valuable and frankly irreplaceable, for companies that are really looking to work within the healthcare space. And so just keeping in mind what it is we're exactly bringing to the table. I don't think, maybe for some folks it's their wonderful spreadsheet skills, but they're maybe not for the majority. And so that's why I think it's always important to kind of remember what exactly it is you're wanting to solve, what exactly it is you want to be bringing to the table as you consider that medicine industry balance.
That feels like a reminder that is helpful to think of early and often, especially for physicians who undervalue themselves and their role and their contribution. Thank you for pointing that out for the audience. I'm really curious. We had a great conversation with Jessica Hudak, expert in all things IP, in-house counsel at Edwards Lifescience, and we chatted a little bit about how she thinks about AI and the general approach to ownership and protecting ideas. And curious if we might be able to walk through for a few minutes how you both have been thinking about that, how you've been advised to think about that, what you are trying to protect, just that whole consideration.
Yeah, it's been interesting to think about how the historical structure around IP and licensing and patentability has been set up, because it seems like it's not reflective of what feels like the reality of innovating in the data sciences and AI space. And trying to understand why has been a really big piece of our journey. We've had the fortune of getting some guidance and advice from some people who sit on the front lines of doing this on a regular basis. And, who are very frank with us that, as novel as it is and as much as it will have impact, um, is it or is it not patentable? And I think for us, what's been interesting is to see that, you can reinvent a pen that doesn't have much function, but because you can diagram it and it's an object, it's more patentable than reorganizing a structure of data and analytics and human interactions. And for certain buzzwords that I think have historical meaning, it's not patentable. Um, or at least it's perceived to not be patentable. I will say, I think we have been persistent in pushing the boundaries of highlighting how similar this is to redesigning a pen. And the know-how around doing this is more than just a math equation. And the opportunity that's leveraged by inserting this at the right point and the coordination of all these moving parts actually is inventive, and that it's not something that anybody can just think of off the bat, and that needs to be protected for all the reasons that patents and licensing and knowledge transfer has all these different mechanisms for establishing who created it. So
Mm.
I do think we're in a space where nobody really knows the right answer, where it's all around seeing how innovative the U.S. Patent Office or the university or wants to be. And I think we've had the fortune of people wanting to be a little bit more innovative and thoughtful, and we've been convincing and sharing our perspective on what is the invention around AI. The other side, people seem to have this perspective of, oh, the data is telling you what's going on, so it's not really your invention; it's the data's. Really, like the idea like it does as much as you program it to do and see, and then also as you apply it. And in our cases, it isn't just about an algorithm sitting there that people go to. It's about an algorithm that is acting like a robot, if you will, within
Mm,
a dynamic where it needs to be controlled and monitored and told to give a task. So, we've sort of taken that approach to it, but I will be interested in seeing 10 years from now where there is more volume in the space and more individuals and cases testing the existing framework, how things shift.
mm. I'd love to go back to a topic you mentioned a few minutes ago, Maya, in terms of skepticism and uh, almost the way doctors may frame that around the do no harm and the way that can sometimes impede doing good. Have you been able to overcome skepticism? For instance, with the study that you recently embarked on with this silent pilot, what has that process been like, specifically having to deal with skepticism and overcome objections?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe start on this one. I know Gabrielle has lots of thoughts on this too. I think on the one side that we've sort of taken the do no harm as like it's just how it works. It's just the
Yeah.
nature of the beast. I mean, which I feel like a lot of folks who are innovating in this space don't sit where we sit. So we understand the do no harm, and maybe if any, we probably carry that ethic within us too, because we too, before we learned medicine, like signed on to this being the way that we work. I mean, I will say it has encouraged us to take this research framework where it's about getting the evidence that it will work. And we have been on this journey, a total of probably 15 years, 20 years plus between the two of us of getting that evidence to prove it will work to get the trust and the assurance that it's going to do more good than harm. So I feel like almost the part of the innovation for us has been around getting that evidence and showing it when we want to embark on the next step to get the trust of the people who otherwise the do no harm gatekeepers to open the gates for us to take one more step. So it has ended up being a lot more incremental than I think a lot of startup companies have the ability to tolerate doing, which is another reason why staying on the university side, pursuing it from a research framework has been very advantageous. You're actually
Mm,
getting the evidence to overcome the use case barrier and the environmental and cultural barriers that will move the field of medicine to do more things like this, as opposed to coming from the outside, knowing, having all the same enthusiasm, but coming up against barriers because even though we have all the right reasons to suspect it's going to do more good than harm, we don't have the evidence to prove that each one of the steps along the way, um, that we can quantify it.
mm,
And I think a lot of groups will do this by getting a few like early adopter, exciting customers who say, well, let's just try it and are able to, through product sales, really demonstrate that. And I think our hope is to really use the research environment to get that evidence to bring on many early adopters because we can actually show them full evidence for what they can expect from the door. So, I think it is made our progress slower than I think most health tech innovations probably are, but very aligned with the way the life sciences side works for drugs and devices, where they go through all of these steps of getting the evidence. And as a result, it is putting us in a space, again, much more like life sciences, where we are able to look at the clinical impact as being what the sales pitch is what we're offering, as opposed to this is really cool. You should try it because it's innovated and digitized. So we want to say both, but I feel like we are able to leverage the claims that both sides are able to bring to the table because we live on the life sciences framework while also delivering from the health tech side.
Think to add onto that, while I think truly the central reason I think we're able to get skepticism is the evidence, right? That is, I think, truly a core value of ourselves as researchers, but as the idea of a future business is really what is central to everything that we're doing. But then I also think what is helpful in terms of our framing actually has to do with some of the specifics within the product that we're working in, and that is that it's an augmenting intelligence. So it is not just a pure running away by itself. It is working on its own. It is making decisions on its own, but we're not now cutting the human out. We found that in our pilots and in our simulations that we actually found that the AI was performing better than humans, which is great. But if you add humans plus AI, it works even better and has a better equity performance. And so, why not? Someone's still going to have to be there for registration and take in your insurance card and everything like that. So, why not leverage both at the same time. And so I think that and augmenting intelligence, I think, is becoming a more and more popular idea of introducing artificial intelligence into health systems. It still gives it a safety check. It is really more acting as a fail-safe, and so more of a backup rather than necessarily
Mm.
working on the more aggressive offensive side, or I should say, moving forward, it's more defensive. And so I think that that world of augmenting intelligence really allows for a space for artificial intelligence to start to make its play within healthcare, allowing it to be, I think, more palatable, and I think allowing it to be something that is usable,
Mm.
given it has the evidence that it is going to do what it is saying it's going to do.
Yeah, and maybe add too that this idea people bring in this concept of human in the loop, and there are lots of iterations. Like, is it a human who's doing it after AI has informed them? Is it AI that's doing it with a human checking in on it? And I'd almost say that this is slightly different, where it's a matter of like the AI is in the loop, the human is still doing what they do, but the AI is there as a failsafe to check on the human activity to ensure it's not falling short of goal. And when it is
Mm.
falling short of goal, being able to step in. So it's been a slightly different framework that I think is, as Gabrielle was saying, it's much more palatable and acceptable for the way that medicine works.
Final question. I don't want to push you either of you over time. Really curious. I've been seeing all of the incredible accomplishments that you guys have had on social media, and you are everywhere, speaking everywhere. And I remember, I forget Maya or Gabrielle, I forget who mentioned this, but one of you mentioned that that's not unintentional. That your visibility is kind of out there with this project, and I'd love to know in the final minute or so uh, your thoughts on that, how that's been going, how that happened. That's advice from outside or within. Super curious.
Certainly has been, something that has been quite intentional. I think advice from Maya is partially at least what's been inspiring this. I feel like she is somebody who is very good about, getting the word out and making sure, that we're speaking on the topic. And I think our strategy has really been, we work within emergency medicine, and the beauty of emergency medicine is that we connect with so many different specialties. And so obviously for this one, we're connecting kind of in the cardiology space. So kind of reaching out more on the cardiology side of things, working or reaching out more on the informatics side of things. So we recently published it within JAMIA, which was the American Medical Informatics Journal, which was really exciting. And also being able to speak in a lot of those different places, trying to connect what I think is multiple worlds all into one, because we speak to the emergency physician, and I think our slide deck changes a little bit, and then we speak to an informatics office or people, and it changes a little bit different versus a cardiology office versus somebody else. And so we're working to really hone in on working with each of these different individual groups, to be able to share a unifying message, which is our ability to really help move heart attack care into the future.
Yeah, and I think too, our hope is that our innovation isn't something that happens in a back lab or on a laptop late at night in somebody's, office. That the steps in the journey that we've taken we're hoping are pushing the thinking in the field forward towards clinical impact. And so I think on one level, there's advocacy for our patients who need more people to think like this. And we know there's lots of talent on the data sciences and tech side. We want them on the medical side. We want them to understand the culture on the medical side. We want the culture of medicine to understand the power of AI and health tech innovation and the complexity of the informatics data systems and why they need advancement too to really bridge these two worlds.
Hmm.
So I think there's scientific advocacy, there's clinical advocacy, or maybe public health advocacy, but there's also innovation advocacy of where there's their opportunity and how do you break in. So, our hope is that not just our work impacting in this one disease process in this one way, but the journey itself really requires us to break down silos. And I think we're uniquely trained where we've kind of trained across the silos and we belong to these different clubs, but really wanting all these clubs to merge into be one big community that is angling towards making healthcare opportunity better for patients and also leveraging tech to make resources really scale in a way that has higher impact than the way that we're doing it now or the way that we did it 5 years ago. So there is, we're hoping that it calls attention to specifically what we're doing, but also to level the field and lower the activation energy for others to come on board and do similar work.
Wow.
If I might just add, I think, especially in the artificial intelligence space, I think you see a lot of papers about AI in healthcare. Now, AI is going to change the world of healthcare. I don't know, maybe it'll replace all the doctors, maybe it won't, maybe it'll do all sorts of different things. But I think what the space was not necessarily filled with was a lot of cases of how did we actually do this? And it's not necessarily the pretty pontification work, right? It's the hard work that it takes to grit it out, to be able to look at how you're actually going to plug it in, look at how you're actually going to put it into a workflow, and how we're actually maybe even moving that particular integration field forward of what does it actually look like to put AI in healthcare rather than something we're just sort of thinking of.
And just as we wrap up, I think one of the, when Gabrielle's mentioning how do we do this exactly, again, we circling back to the beginning of our conversation, healthcare is resistant to innovation in many ways because we want to do no harm. And as a result, there are lots of regulatory checks that have been there for good reasons. How do you get AI through those regulatory checks? So that's a lot of work. But it's important to do. And I think those regulatory rules, very much like intellectual property protection, they were built for a different type of use case. And so bending those barriers and flexing them to be more supportive of AI innovation moving forward more quickly is, I think, where we're looking to be impactful right now. So that is definitely something we're learning about. And this is information security, cybersecurity, patient privacy, data accessibility, systems for data breach. Health systems have, ways that they typically protect their data, but are there other ways that they can get the same outcome without having the same restrictive um, list of things they'll say yes to? And I
Mm,
think those conversations are informative as well. So we're hoping that'll be part of the next frontier.
wow. Well, Maya and Gabrielle, so special talking with you both. This is super neat. And selfishly, I'm glad I got to hear the full update and everything that's going on. Where should I direct people to learn more about what you're both doing, follow along in this journey?
Yeah, I think we both keep a lot of the latest updates of what we're doing posted on LinkedIn, as well as our lab website that shares many of the updates.
I'll have both of your LinkedIn's linked up in the show notes, and
Okay,
I'll have the your lab website linked up there also.
great.
Oh, fantastic.
Great.
Yeah,
Well, thank you both.
yeah, David, thanks for asking us to do this. This was really great.
Oh, of course.